school every day, I confronted, all the sort of things that all the other boys in my neighborhood and girls in my neighborhood confronted.
Which was the risk of violence?
All the time. All the time. Constant. It's the little things, the very, very little things, which as a child, I have to tell you, I took as normal. But, now I look back and it's insane. For instance, how many people am I walking with when I go to school? I think about that one all the time because I remember when Allen Iverson came into the NBA, and it was all this sort of hubbub about why is he always with a posse? Why does he need a posse? But I understood exactly why he needed a posse because he had come from a place where it was quite clear where you needed security around you because you never knew what somebody might do to you.
But growing up there, then did you think I'm going to do what with my life?
I had no idea.
Really?
I had no idea. I knew what I liked, but I did not. I had no idea what I liked might actually, be a career because as I was instructed, what you did with your life or how successful you were in life was basically determined by how well you did in school. I was not a particularly high-performing student at all. And so I was, as I write about in the book, I was kind of caught between two things. Because even as I just, taught you about these rules for keeping yourself, out of danger, I wasn't the best at that either. I wasn't the best at, street life either. I certainly was, nobody's thug or anything like that. But at the same time, I can't say that, I even had the security of being a nerd and being great in school. I didn't have that either. And so I had no idea what was going to become of me. And that, too, added to the kind of fear that I remembered. Because for young black boys growing up in West Baltimore in that period, and I suspect growing up in our cities today, school is not just, will I get into Harvard or not? It's not, how far up the ladder. It's will I go to jail or not? Will I be shot or not? It's a matter of life and death. And that's, the way parents talk to kids when I was, a child, and that was the message that we took in.
And is it true today in Baltimore?
I don't know. And I suspect it is. And I'm just, I've been asked about Baltimore quite a bit, but I want to be very clear. I haven't lived in Baltimore in 20 years. But from what I can tell, and from what I've seen when I go back to visit family, I strongly suspect. So, yes. For instance, I just want to highlight this. The video of the woman beating on her son. The young man who she caught throwing.
And everybody was praising her and saying she's installing discipline. We need more parents like that.
Yes, but that's fear. And I think people need to be very, very clear. She said, I don't want him to end up like another Freddie Gray. That is fear that you're seeing from that woman. And I think people just...
Fear that her son might be next.
Oh, yes, very much so. Very much so. Fear, and she wants him to go home, where she feels that he's safe and, can be protected. That was very familiar to me.
That's the product also of what's commonly called, what's the talk that parents give their children.
Yes.
And as they say, you've got to stay away from where violence might happen.
Right. And because...
And more, though.
Right, and African-American parents understand the consequence. I mean, they really...
Talk.
Yes, very much so. And the idea is that you have to educate your children on how to basically deal with violence. And while over the past year we've seen that violence focus on the police and the things that police do, and that's part of it. When I was a child, and I suspect it's the same. For other folks, I know it's the same with my son, with my child. It doesn't just concern the violence of the police. It concerns the violence of the neighbor. African-American neighborhoods are, on balance, much more violent than other neighborhoods.
And why is that?
Well, I think that goes right back to, what I was trying to write about in the case for reparations. African-Americans, after, enslavement, after that period, did not, walk out of, the chains and the labor and the cotton fields and immediately walk into America. In fact, they suffered 100 years of segregation. The thing I focused on in my article in the case for reparations was housing segregation. That's very, very, very important because housing segregation restricts where you can live, obviously. It also, restricts what you can do with your money because housing is so central to wealth in this country. It restricts, what you're exposed to because your kids can only live in, certain neighborhoods in certain areas. And on top of that is all the other sort of discrimination that African Americans suffered from. And I'm talking about job discrimination in terms of federal programs, discrimination in schools, discrimination in higher education. All of that piled into one single geographic region, and the inability to escape that. It creates a sense of deprivation. It creates a kind of frustration. You have people who have obvious economic needs. And so it's no surprise that those neighborhoods tend to be more violent than other neighborhoods where people have more opportunities.
You escaped to Harvard. I mean, to Harvard.
Not quite Harvard.
Well, but for you, it was better than
Right,
Harvard.
yeah, for me it was. You're right about that. It was.
You called it Mecca.
Yeah, I guess I did. Yeah, yes. That's as it was referred to because of the long history that Howard University has of attracting people like Toni Morrison, for instance. It was an awakening for me, in many ways. That was probably the first place where I saw black people who were doing a variety of things. And again, I'd been aware of that. I was not, totally, completely deprived. I was not really deprived at all. But this was like the first place where you met, black people who would do, and I feel silly saying this, but, somebody might say something to you like, I'm going to take a year off and, go study in Spain.
Yes.
I was like, what? This, really? You can do that?
You could do that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it was like a kind of, like, that actually happens. The world is not as restricted as you think it is. Just little things like that, having professors who are from other places, a professor from, I think about this now, from Trinidad, who just, the very thing I was talking about when I was talking about, like, what housing segregation deprives you of. I had so much exposure at Howard University to just, completely other ways of living, quite frankly.
You also thought about being a poet, didn't you?
Yes, I did. I very much wanted to be a poet, and I wrote quite a bit, probably the first 2 or 3 years after I left my parents' home. And I think, even though I didn't end up being a poet, I think that really, marked my journalism, like that study.
Because it was about command of language, or?
Yeah, and I think ultimately poetry is about the economy of language.
Yeah, exactly. The economy of language.
Right. I mean, it's command too, but it's economy, and that is so crucial in journalism. The ability to say something with as much power as you can in the briefest amount of space.
You met a friend of mine and a friend of yours, David Carter. Your sort of first job.
Yes.
As a reporter.
Yes.
You spoke eloquently about him.
Mm-hmm.
What did he do that made you feel so thankful?
Well, David saved my life. As I was telling you before, so I think I met David about 2 years after I had gone to college, and I was telling you, so I'm like 2 years out of Baltimore at that point, and I was telling you before, even as I got to how it was not clear to me that I would make anything of myself. I came from a very, very positive home, where folks really, really encouraged me.
But your dad also been a former Black Panther?
He was, and just a person with really, really high expectations for his children. And it was not clear to me that I had the ability to live up to those expectations. It was not clear to me that I just had it within me. And when I went to work for David, very, very he made it clear that I could do this, and I could write, and that was possible, and I could actually make a living doing that. And to me, it was I could not believe that the essence of the job was you find some interesting question, you call some people up, you go meet with some people to investigate it, and then you write it down.
Yes.
And then they give you a check for it.
But he taught you.
Oh my God! I remember the story I think about most with David is I had caught wind of a story in Washington. This is the sort of story that I used to have to do at this time. To actually perform the act of evictions when people would not pay their rent, there was a service, and they were going around hiring homeless people to do these evictions. Homeless people making other people homeless effectively. Now, David, as someone, was a brilliant journalist, but knew he had to sell a paper. That headline, just got him right away. And he said, go find that story. Go find it. I had no, hint of who was doing or where it was. And I went down to a homeless shelter, a few days after he sent me there. And I just went up to the first person, scared out of my mind, and said, hi, do you do evictions? And the guy looked at me and he said, no, but that guy over there does. And that was a story. And he demanded that you go out and face that fear of asking people awkward questions, He was very good about that.
And then Atlantic came next?
No. No, I started working with David like in '99, and I probably didn't find it. I worked a series of really not fun jobs. I think I lost 3 straight jobs, and I came to the Atlantic in 2008. Through David, by the way, who got me that job too.
Well, because was it Jamie? He knew Jamie Bennett?
He knew James Bennett. That's exactly it. He knew James Bennett, and they had been at the times. I think they had overlapped at you should take a look at this guy. I'm sorry David's not here to see all this.
Well, I
really
do
am.
too. I miss him. And, he was
Yeah.
such a often guest on this program,
Mhm.
and he just had something unique about the ability to go right to
Yeah.
the core. And even if everybody else was somewhere else, he knew where the
He
truth
did.
was.
He did. He did. He did.
Why is what you are doing so resonating so much and so deeply with people like Toni Morrison?
That I can't answer. That I can't answer. I don't know. What I can tell you is I think this. I think certain aspects of African American humanity, and anger is one of those aspects, are not allowed to be aired out to other people. I think there's a great fear when black people talk about their anger, when they talk about their negative emotions, when they talk about their hatred of certain things. I think that makes people very, very uncomfortable.
You also think, though, that, and help me understand, and I don't want to define you, I want you to define yourself, in a sense that there is built in to the established America an understanding that building on slavery, that what we have is people who feel empowered
Mm-hmm.
to do violence to the body of other people. And I select those terms,
Yeah.
violence
Right.
and body,
Right.
directly from reading you.
Right. Yeah, I do think that, and I think that we have.
It gives them power and control.
Yeah, and I think we have ways of covering that. Even for people as they do it. One of the things I've tried to make clear repeatedly is any sort of term that you think, is innocuous or a euphemism that relates to race and policy in terms of race and black people ultimately comes back to violence and doing violence to African American bodies. For instance, you take something that seems terribly abstract and disconnected from this, a debate over affirmative action. Well, how is that related to physical violence? Well, I assure you, those folks, those African Americans here in this country that want their kids to go, and you can leave aside what you think of the policy, whether you like it or not. But those African Americans who are trying to get those advantages for their kids are trying to get them in the hopes that they improve their station and grow up somewhere that's not like where they grew up. Behind that is not just I don't want you to grow up poor, working class, or whatever. It's almost always I don't want you to have to walk out the door and have to look and watch your back the way I did. It's everywhere. It's in the air.
Your son.
Yes.
That's why you're writing this letter.
Yes.
That brings me to an essential point here. Is that it is still very much with us.
Mm-hmm.
This act of violence against the body.
Mm-hmm.
Your terms.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You have a basic difference in terms of how you see that from the president. Probably you debate
Yes. That's true.
Exactly.
Yes. I think the president reflects, in his public comments, and to the extent that that we've had this debate this time, a kind of optimism that is very much rooted in the African American experience. I think the notion of hope, the notion that it will be better tomorrow, is almost, or maybe not even almost, religious within the African American community. A lot of that comes out of the church, and the aspect or the belief that good ultimately does triumph, that justice ultimately does win out at the end of the day. There is a sense of inevitable progress. The quote that Martin Luther King used to use and that the president now uses, the arc of the moral universe, right, long, but it bends towards justice. And I don't